Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back 2,000 years to explore something so ordinary it's almost invisible in the history book's breakfast in ancient Rome. You're about to discover what it felt like to wake up hungry in the world's most powerful empire, when the first meal of the day was barely a meal at all. Just a quick bite before the real business of living began. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why breakfast was once considered the least important meal, or why wine at dawn wasn't considered remotely strange. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or maybe share what you had for breakfast today. I'd love to know if any of you are brave enough to try a Roman morning meal after hearing this story. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You open your eyes in the dim half-light of dawn, somewhere around the year 150 AD. The room around you is small, cramped even, with walls that don't quite reach the ceiling of the apartment above. You're in an insula, one of those towering Roman apartment blocks that house most of the city's population, and already you can hear the sounds of 1 million people beginning their day. Footsteps echo on wooden stairs. A baby cries 3 floors up. Someone is arguing in rapid Latin about rent or bread or both. The smell of smoke drifts through your window, not the pleasant wood smoke of a countryside hearth, but the acrid, oily smoke of a city that cooks with whatever burns. Your stomach growls, a small, insistent reminder that you haven't eaten since yesterday's main meal in the late afternoon. Romans don't think much about breakfast. It's not a social event, not a lingering family gathering around a loaded table. It's a functional necessity, something to quiet your belly until the real eating begins later. The word they use is ientaculum. Though many Romans don't even bother naming it, they just break their fast with whatever's nearby and get on with their day. You swing your legs off the thin mattress, feeling the morning chill on your bare feet. There's no central heating here, no cosy kitchen waiting with the smell of bacon and eggs. Those things don't exist yet, not in the way you know them. Instead, you face a choice that millions of Romans face every morning. Do you eat at home, grabbing whatever dried or leftover food sits in your cupboard? Or do you head straight out into the streets where vendors and food stalls are already calling out their offerings? The hierarchy of Roman meals tells you everything about how the empire views breakfast. At the bottom sits your ientaculum, barely acknowledged. In the middle, there's prandium, a light lunch that's only slightly more substantial, and towering above both, demanding attention and time and money, sits cena dinner, the evening meal where Romans actually gather, recline, socialize, and eat with intention. Your breakfast is the afterthought, the forgotten child of the Roman daily schedule. But here's the thing that might surprise you: this wasn't always about poverty or lack of food. Even wealthy Romans treated breakfast casually. The difference was just that poor Romans had no choice but to keep it simple, while rich Romans chose simplicity for breakfast before gorging themselves at dinner. It's a strange kind of democracy, this shared dismissal of the morning meal. A senator and a dock worker might both grab bread and cheese at dawn, though the quality of that bread and cheese would tell very different stories. You shuffle toward the small shelf where food is kept, if you can call it keeping. There's no refrigeration, no icebox, no way to preserve things beyond salting, drying, smoking, or pickling. What you eat for breakfast has to be either freshly bought that morning or stable enough to survive without spoiling. This limitation shapes everything about Roman eating, turning breakfast into a parade of preserved foods, yesterday's bread, and drinks that are more about safety than pleasure. The sky outside is turning from black to deep blue, that transitional shade that promises sunrise but hasn't delivered it yet. You can hear the bread sellers already. their voices carrying up through the narrow streets. Fresh loaves warm from the oven, best price before noon. It's a lie. Probably the best prices were always earlier, and these loaves have likely been sitting for an hour already, but the call is comforting in its familiarity. Bread is the constant, the foundation, the one thing that unites every Roman breakfast regardless of class or location. You're hungry enough now that your hand reaches almost automatically for the clay jug in the corner. It's not water. Romans rarely drink plain water if they can help it, viewing it with suspicion unless it comes from a known, clean source like an aqueduct. Instead, the jug contains posca, a mixture of water and sour wine that soldiers drink, that workers drink, that almost everyone drinks because the wine kills whatever nasty things might be lurking in the water. It tastes sharp and thin, nothing like the rich wine served at dinner parties, but it wakes you up and it's safe, and right now, that's enough. The city is coming alive around you in layers. First came the bakers, working through the night so their ovens would be hot and their loaves ready at dawn. Then came the water carriers, the waste collectors, the construction workers heading to their projects. Soon the markets will open fully, the bathhouses will begin heating their waters, the lawyers and politicians will emerge from their comfortable homes to conduct the business of empire. And you, like most Romans, will begin this elaborate day with barely more than a mouthful of food, a gulp of diluted wine, and the understanding that real eating happens later, when the sun goes down and the day's work is finally done. Do you remember being told that breakfast is the most important meal of the day? The Romans would have laughed at that idea. Or more likely, they wouldn't have understood it at all. Your hand reaches for the small wooden board near the shelf, where yesterday's bread sits wrapped in cloth. This is the entaculum in its most basic form, the meal that's barely a meal, the breaking of fast that Romans squeeze between waking and working. You unwrap the loaf slowly, feeling its texture. It's not soft anymore, not like it was when it came from the bakery. The crust has hardened overnight, and the interior has taken on that dense, chewy quality that happens when bread ages without modern preservatives or plastic wrapping to trap moisture inside. But here's something that might surprise you. Romans actually prefer their bread slightly stale. Fresh bread is wonderful at dinner, certainly, but for breakfast the denser texture is better for soaking up wine, for holding cheese, for being portable. You tear off a chunk. Romans rarely use knives for casual eating, preferring to break bread with their hands in a gesture so common it's become metaphorical in languages that won't exist for centuries. The bread is dark, made from whole grain flour that includes everything the wheat kernel has to offer. None of the refined white flour that will one day become a status symbol. Your teeth work through it slowly. It tastes earthy, yeasty, with a slight tang that comes from the sourdough starter every baker guards like treasure. Next comes the cheese. You pull out a small piece from the earthenware pot where it sits submerged in brine to keep it from spoiling. This isn't the aged, complex cheese you might find at a wealthy Roman's dinner table. No aged pecorino that's been buried for months. No expensive imports from distant provinces. This is fresh cheese, simple and salty, made from goat or sheep milk because cows are still relatively uncommon in many parts of the empire. The Romans call it caseus, and it's so fundamental to their diet that it appears at almost every meal in some form. You shake off the excess brine and place the cheese on your bread, feeling how the salt crystals catch on your fingers. The combination is older than Rome itself, this pairing of bread and cheese. Shepherds ate it in the hills before the city existed. Soldiers carried it on campaigns that pushed the empire's boundaries to Britannia and Mesopotamia. It's not exciting, not the kind of food anyone would write poetry about, but it's reliable. It's filling enough, and it requires absolutely no preparation beyond what you've just done. In a world without breakfast cereals, without eggs and bacon, without the morning foods you know, This simplicity is the standard. Now comes the drink. You pour yourself a cup of posca from the clay jug, watching how it catches the growing light from your window. The colour is pale, somewhere between pink and amber, diluted enough that you'd barely recognise it as wine at all. Some mornings, if there's a bit of honey available, you might sweeten it into something called mulsum, but today it's just the basic mixture sour wine cut with water in a ratio that varies depending on who's pouring and what's available. The taste hits your tongue sharp and acidic, with just enough wine flavour to remind you what it came from. Romans drink this constantly, from dawn until dusk, because the alternative plain water from unknown sources might kill you slower than any barbarian sword. Historians still argue whether Romans actually understood the connection between wine and water safety, or if they just preferred the taste and the mild alcohol helped them tolerate their difficult lives. The truth probably lives somewhere in the middle. They noticed that people who drank wine-water mixtures got sick less often than those who drank from questionable sources. But they attributed it to the wine's quality and strength, rather than understanding fermentation and bacteria. Either way, you're drinking it now, feeling it wash down the bread and cheese, creating a breakfast that's been eaten by millions of Romans across 3 continents. If you have a few extra coins, and today let's imagine you do, you might add something special to this basic meal. From another small pot, you retrieve a handful of olives, their skins wrinkled and dark from preservation in salt and oil. They're intensely flavoured, almost overwhelming if you're not used to them. Each one a tiny explosion of brine and bitterness and fat. Romans love olives obsessively, growing them everywhere the climate permits, pressing them for oil, eating them at every meal, using them as currency in some regions. You pop 2 in your mouth, working around the pits with practiced tongue movements, feeling how they complement the bland bread and salty cheese. Some mornings might also bring a few dried figs if the season was good, and you managed to save some from last autumn. Or perhaps a small piece of yesterday's leftover meat. Though that's rare, for breakfast meat is expensive and usually reserved for the evening cena, when you can actually taste and appreciate it properly. The morning meal isn't about pleasure or variety or the kind of culinary adventure Romans reserve for their elaborate dinner parties. It's about function, about getting food into your body quickly enough that you can begin your day without your stomach protesting too loudly. The whole meal takes you perhaps 10 minutes, eaten while standing or sitting on the edge of your bed, without ceremony or attention. There's no breakfast table groaning under the weight of options, no leisurely morning routine of coffee and newspapers that won't be invented for more than a millennium. You eat, you drink, and you're done. The bread sits heavy in your stomach. The cheese provides salt and fat. The posca wakes you up with its acidity, and the olives add just enough flavour to make the whole experience not entirely boring. You notice, as you finish, that you're still hungry. Not painfully so, but there's definitely room for more food. This is normal. Intacculum isn't meant to fill you completely. It's meant to tide you over until prandium at midday, which will itself be light, which will tide you over until cena in a late afternoon, when real eating finally begins. Romans structure their day around an evening feast, treating all earlier meals as mere preludes to that main event. Your breakfast is just the opening note, barely audible, easily forgotten. And yet, despite its humble nature, this simple meal connects you to something vast. From Londinium to Alexandria, from the Rhine frontier to the deserts of Africa, millions of people are eating similar breakfasts at this very moment. The bread might be slightly different, the cheese might come from different animals, but the basic pattern holds. The empire runs on bread and wine and cheese eaten quickly at dawn before the real day begins. It's not glamorous, but it works, and working is what Rome does best. But here's where the simple story of bread and cheese becomes complicated. Your breakfast depends entirely on who you are in Rome's rigid social pyramid. The meal you just ate, modest as it was, already places you somewhere in the middle of society. Someone with enough coins for cheese and olives, someone who isn't starving but certainly isn't wealthy. Now let's explore how breakfast changes as you move up and down the economic ladder, because in Rome, even the smallest meal reveals everything about your place in the world. Imagine first that you're a slave, one of the millions of enslaved people who keep the empire functioning. You wake not in your own small room, but in cramped quarters shared with a dozen others, possibly in the basement of your master's house, or in a corridor near the kitchen. Your breakfast, if you can call it that, arrives at the whim of whoever manages the household's food supply. On good days you receive a chunk of coarse bread, darker and cheaper than what free Romans eat, made from barley instead of wheat because barley is what you feed to animals and slaves. The texture is dense, almost gritty, and it sits in your stomach like a stone. There's no cheese unless yesterday's pea started turning, and your master decided slaves should eat it before it becomes completely inedible. No olives, no wine, just water, and you drink it knowing the free Romans above you would never touch it. Some slaves fare better, of course. If you work in a wealthy household as a skilled cook or a trusted personal attendant, you might eat the leftover scraps from your master's dinner the night before actual meat sometimes. Better bread, wine that's only slightly sour. But most slaves face a breakfast that's barely sufficient to fuel the hard labour ahead. A calculated minimum that keeps you alive and working without wasting resources your master could sell or consume himself. The Romans have done the mathematics of human survival, and your breakfast reflects their cold efficiency. Now shift upward to a poor plebeian, a free Roman citizen who works with his hands, maybe a day labourer at the docks, or a leather worker, or someone who rents out muscle and sweat for a few coins. Your breakfast improves, but only slightly. You probably can't afford to keep much food in your tiny apartment because storage costs money and space is expensive in the crowded insulae. So you head down to the streets as soon as you wake, joining the crowds at the public grain distribution if it's distribution day. Rome provides free bread to its citizens, a remarkable welfare program designed to prevent riots and keep the population manageable. The bread is basic, made from the public grain supply, but it's yours by right of citizenship. A daily reminder that being Roman means something even when you're poor. If it's not distribution day, you stop at a thermopolium, one of those fast food counters that dot every street corner, where large clay pots embedded in stone counters hold various foods kept warm overnight. You point at what you want, maybe a porridge made from grain and water, perhaps some chickpeas stewed with onions, possibly a bit of sausage if you've had a good week. The proprietor ladles it into a small clay bowl or wraps it in a leaf. You pay your coins far fewer than a proper meal would cost, and you eat it standing in the street while heading to work. This is breakfast for millions of Romans, eaten on the move, purchased rather than prepared, functional rather than pleasurable. It's fast food 2,000 years before McDonald's, and it serves the same purpose, feeding people who don't have time or resources for anything better. Your posca comes from the same counter, stored in large amphorae and served in cups that multiple strangers will use today. Nobody worries about hygiene the way your modern mind does. Shared cups are normal. Plates get wiped rather than washed, and the Roman immune system is battle-hardened from constant exposure to everything. You drink, you eat, you move on. The whole transaction takes maybe 5 minutes. But now, and here's where breakfast becomes genuinely interesting, imagine you're a patrician, a member of Rome's elite, someone with a house rather than an apartment, with slaves to serve you and income from properties across the empire. You wake in a proper bedroom with plastered walls, possibly decorated with frescoes. The morning light filters through expensive glass windows, a luxury most Romans never experience. And yet, even you, with all your wealth and status, treat breakfast as a minor affair. The difference is only in the quality of the minor affair. Your slave brings you breakfast on a small tray, proper dishes, not the wooden board or clay pot of common Romans. The bread is white, made from refined flour that's been sifted multiple times to remove all the coarse bran. It's softer, lighter, more expensive by magnitudes than the dark loaves of the poor. Your cheese might be aged pecorino from specialized producers, its flavor complex and sharp. Nothing like the simple fresh cheese soaking in brine. Instead of local olives, you might have import Spanish olives famous across the empire, or even pickled delicacies from Greece. Your wine is better too, mixed with water still, but starting from a vintage that actually tastes pleasant rather than merely safe. Some wealthy Romans add exotic touches to their morning meal, a few dates from North Africa, sweet and sticky, or honey drizzled over bread in a combination that's almost dessert-like. Perhaps some nuts, roasted and salted, stored in sealed containers to keep them fresh. If you're feeling particularly indulgent, you might have your cook prepare a soft cheese mixed with herbs, something that requires actual preparation rather than just pulling ingredients from storage. Historians still argue whether wealthy Romans regularly ate eggs for breakfast chickens exist, and eggs appear in Roman recipes, but most sources suggest eggs were reserved for dinner rather than morning meals. The truth is probably that some patricians ate eggs occasionally, but it wasn't standard practice the way it would become in later European breakfasts. But here's the remarkable thing: even as a wealthy Roman, you still don't linger over breakfast. You still eat quickly, often alone, treating it as fuel rather than an experience. The social eating, the reclining on couches, the elaborate dishes and entertainment, all of that waits for dinner. Your breakfast might be made from superior ingredients, served on better dishes, but the attitude toward it remains essentially the same. It's not a meal worth celebrating or extending. You eat. Perhaps you read a letter or review some documents while eating, and then you move on to the actual business of your day, managing properties, conducting legal affairs, engaging in politics, supervising slaves, or simply socializing with other wealthy Romans in the forum and baths. The gap between rich and poor breakfast isn't as vast as the gap between rich and poor dinner. A patrician's evening feast might include dormice stuffed with pork and pine nuts, peacock prepared in elaborate sauces, wines from specific famous vineyards, imported spices worth their weight in silver. But is breakfast better bread, better cheese, but still just bread and cheese at its core? The morning meal is the great equalizer, the one time when Romans of all classes do roughly the same thing, even if the quality varies dramatically. Everyone breaks their fast simply, quickly, and without ceremony, saving their appetite and attention for the meal that actually matters when the sun begins its descent toward evening. You stand now in the kitchen where your breakfast was prepared, or rather, where it should have been prepared if you're fortunate enough to have access to one. The reality is that most Romans don't have proper kitchens at all, and understanding this changes everything about how you imagine their morning meal. Let's step into this space, or the lack of it, and discover why so many Romans eat breakfast purchased from street vendors rather than cooked at home. Your apartment in the insula has no kitchen. This isn't an oversight or a sign of extreme poverty, it's just how most Romans live. The building's landlord has forbidden cooking fires in individual apartments because fire is the greatest terror of Roman city life, and these towering wooden structures burn with horrifying regularity. You've heard the stories, everyone has, of entire blocks consumed in hours, of families trapped on upper floors as flames climb wooden staircases, of the night sky turning orange as another insula collapses into ember and ash. So cooking is banned, or at least heavily restricted, leaving you dependent on cold foods or prepared meals from the thermopolia and street vendors who feed the city's million-plus residents. But let's imagine you're among the minority who does have access to a cooking space. Perhaps you live on the ground floor where regulations are slightly more relaxed, or you're in a private home rather than an apartment block. The kitchen you enter is nothing like the bright, spacious room with counters and appliances that the word kitchen conjures in your modern mind. This is a small, smoky, dark space, often located in the least desirable part of the house because it's hot, dangerous, and filled with odours that wealthy Romans would rather not experience directly. The heart of this kitchen is the hearth, the focus, a raised platform of brick or stone where fire burns most of the day. There's no chimney. At least not a good one. Smoke escapes through a hole in the roof or through windows, but mostly it just fills the room with a hazy atmosphere that makes your eyes water and your throat burn. If you're a slave assigned to kitchen duty, you spend your days in this smoke, breathing it constantly, your lungs probably suffering damage that won't be understood for 2,000 years. The Romans know that kitchen slaves often develop persistent coughs, but they attribute it to weakness or disease rather than the environment itself. The fire that heats your morning bread, assuming you're making bread at home, which most Romans don't, burns on charcoal, not wood. Charcoal burns hotter and cleaner than raw wood, producing less smoke and more consistent heat. Someone, probably a slave or the poorest member of the household, had to wake before dawn to kindle this fire from yesterday's embers, carefully feeding it with dry kindling and then charcoal pieces until it reached the right temperature. This is skilled work. Actually controlling a charcoal fire takes experience and attention. Too much air and it burns too hot, wasting expensive fuel. Too little and it dies, forcing you to start over with a laborious process of striking sparks from flint and steel. Over this fire, if you're preparing anything that needs heating to breakfast, you use a metal tripod holding a clay or bronze pot. Most breakfast foods don't require cooking. Your bread and cheese and olives need no heat, but if you're warming some leftover stew from yesterday's dinner, or heating water to mix with wine, or softening old bread in warm liquid, this is how you do it. The pot sits in the flames, and you stir with a wooden spoon that's probably charred black from years of use. The Romans have no concept of temperature control, no knobs to turn or thermostats to set. You learn by experience and constant attention, judging heat by how the fire looks and sounds, by how fast liquids bubble, by the smell of food as it cooks. The counters around this kitchen, if they exist at all, are simple stone or wooden surfaces, often just boards laid across supports. Food preparation happens here, the grinding of grain into flour, though most Romans buy flour already ground because the process is brutally labour-intensive and requires specialised equipment. The mills that grind Rome's grain are mostly commercial operations, large establishments with donkeys walking in endless circles to turn massive stone wheels that crush wheat between them. Some wealthy homes have smaller hand-operated mills, where slaves push wooden handles around and around, reducing grain to flour in a process that takes hours and builds impressive arm muscles. If you're making bread from scratch, and again, most Romans buy bread rather than bake it, you need a large clay or wooden bowl for mixing. Flour goes in first, then water, then salt if you have it. Then a piece of yesterday's dough saved as starter because the Romans use wild yeast fermentation, not the packaged yeast, you know. Your hands work the mixture, kneading it into a sticky mass that gradually becomes elastic and smooth. This takes time and strength. Roman bread dough is stiffer than modern dough because their flour has higher protein content and hasn't been bred for the soft texture contemporary bread makers prefer. Your forearms burn as you work, pushing the heel of your hand into the dough, folding it over, pushing again, in a rhythm that's meditative if you're in the right mood and torturous if you're not. But here's the thing. Even if you make the dough at home, you probably don't bake it at home. Most Roman kitchens lack proper ovens because ovens are expensive to build and require significant space and skill to operate. Instead, you take your shaped loaves to a commercial bakery, one of hundreds throughout the city, where professional bakers have massive ovens that can handle dozens of loaves at once. You pay a small fee, they mark your bread somehow to identify it as yours, and you return later to collect it, still warm and smelling magnificent. This system works surprisingly well, creating a network of shared baking infrastructure that allows even relatively poor Romans to eat freshly baked bread without needing their own ovens. The bakery ovens themselves are architectural marvels of their day, dome-shaped chambers made from brick and volcanic stone, designed to retain heat for hours after the fire has burned down. The baker builds a hot fire inside the dome early in the morning, heating the walls and floor until they glow. Then he rakes out the coals, sweeps the oven floor, and slides loaves directly onto the hot surface using a long wooden peel. The bread bakes from radiant heat stored in the stone, creating that crispy crust and soft interior that makes good bread worth the effort. Some historians still argue whether Roman bread was leavened or flat, but the evidence strongly suggests most urban Romans ate raised bread made with sourdough starter, while flatbreads were more common in military camps and rural areas where ovens were less available. Back in your humble kitchen, storage is a constant challenge. You have no refrigeration, no way to keep things cold except possibly storing them in the coolest part of the house or, if you're wealthy, in a basement dug into the earth. Everything you keep must be preserved, somehow dried, salted, pickled, smoked, or stored in oil or honey. The clay amphorae lining one wall hold wine, olive oil, garum that fermented fish sauce Romans use on everything, and various grains. Smaller pots contain olives in brine, cheese in whey, dried fruits that will keep for months if protected from moisture and insects. Nothing is wasted. Stale bread gets soaked and repurposed. Meat bones get boiled into broth. Vegetable scraps go to animals or into soups. The kitchen space smells like smoke and oil and fermentation. Not unpleasant exactly, but foreign to your modern nose. It's a working space, utilitarian and dark, not somewhere you'd want to spend time if you didn't have to. And this is precisely why breakfast remains so simple. The kitchen is too uncomfortable, too labour-intensive, too dangerous for casual cooking. Better to grab your bread and cheese and eat it elsewhere, in your room or in the streets, saving the kitchen's heat and smoke for the evening when a proper cooked meal justifies the effort and discomfort of food preparation. You walk through the pre-dawn streets now, following the scent that every Roman knows instinctively, the smell of baking bread that guides you like an invisible thread through the city's labyrinth of narrow alleys and cramped neighbourhoods. This aroma is Rome's morning perfume, more common than incense, more reliable than the sunrise itself. Bread is everywhere, always, the foundation upon which the entire empire rests. Without bread, Rome doesn't just go hungry, Rome ceases to function, and the emperors know this with the kind of paranoid clarity that keeps them awake at night. The bakery you approach is already buzzing with activity, even though the sun hasn't fully risen. Through the open front, you can see the massive oven dominating the back wall, its domed shape glowing with residual heat from hours of burning. The baker and his slaves, because successful bakeries always employ several workers, are pulling out loaves with long wooden peels, the bread emerging golden and steaming, making your mouth water despite the breakfast you already ate. The Romans call these establishments pistrina, and they're scattered throughout the city in numbers that would astonish you. Some historians estimate one bakery for every 200 people in Rome, an infrastructure dedicated to a single food item that tells you everything about bread's centrality to Roman life. You watch as customers queue up, some to buy bread fresh from the oven, others to collect loaves they brought yesterday as dough for baking. The baker's hands move with practiced efficiency, grabbing loaves, taking coins, making change, all while keeping an eye on the oven temperature and directing his workers in that simultaneously chaotic and organised dance of a busy kitchen. The bread varies in quality and price. The cheapest loaves are dark and dense, made from coarse flour with plenty of bran still present. The mid-range bread, what most free Romans buy, is lighter but still substantial, made from flour that's been sifted once or twice. The expensive bread, displayed separately and costing 3 or 4 times as much, is made from finely sifted white flour that's been processed until almost nothing remains but the pure starchy endosperm. Here's something that connects you directly to these ancient bakers in Pompeii, preserved beneath volcanic ash. Archaeologists found bakeries with loaves still in the ovens, carbonized but intact, showing us exactly what Roman bread looked like. These loaves were round, scored into 8 sections like pre-cut pizza slices, making them easy to break apart and share. Some still bore stamps identifying the baker who made them a kind of ancient trademark. The bread was surprisingly sophisticated. Not the crude, primitive food you might imagine, but the product of centuries of refinement in milling, fermentation, and baking techniques. The grain that becomes this bread travels to Rome from Egypt, from North Africa, from Sicily, the empire's bread baskets that ship millions of tons of wheat annually to feed the capital's endless appetite. The logistics are staggering when you think about them. Ships laden with grain cross the Mediterranean, sail up the Tiber, unload at massive warehouses where officials weigh and record every sack. The grain gets distributed to millers, who grind it into flour, who sell it to bakers, who turn it into bread, which arrives in your hands still warm from the oven. This supply chain, primitive by modern standards, but incredibly sophisticated for its time, keeps 1 million people fed and prevents the riots that topple emperors. The government subsidizes much of this bread through the Annona the grain dole that provides free or cheap grain to Roman citizens. This isn't charity in the way you might understand it. It's social control, political stability purchased with wheat, bread and circuses. The saying goes, keep the people fed and entertained, and they won't overthrow you. Every emperor understands this calculation. Every emperor ensures the grain ships keep arriving, whatever the cost, because running out of bread means running out of power. You buy a loaf now, feeling its weight in your hands, still hot enough to be almost uncomfortable. The crust crackles under your fingers, releasing steam and that intoxicating yeasty smell. The interior is chewy and substantial, quite different from the soft, fluffy bread you might be familiar with. Roman bread has more protein, more structure, more flavour than modern commercial bread. It's made to be satisfying, to fill you up and keep you full because you might not eat again for hours. Breaking off a piece and chewing it, you taste the grain itself. The wheat flavour strong and present rather than hidden beneath sugar and additives that don't exist yet. Some bakeries specialise in different types of bread. There's panis plebeius, the common people's bread, dark and hearty. Panis secundarius, a mid-grade loaf that's most popular. Panis siligineus, the fancy white bread for wealthy Romans, and various regional specialties breads with cheese baked in. Breads studded with olives, breads enriched with milk or oil for special occasions. The variety is actually impressive, showing that even with limited ingredients and technology, Roman bakers found ways to create diversity and cater to different tastes and budgets. The bakery also sells biscuits biscoctus panis, literally twice-cooked bread which are hard, dry, and almost indestructible. These are what sailors take on voyages, what soldiers carry on campaigns, what anyone travelling for more than a day or two packs for the journey. You can break a tooth on these if you're not careful, but soaked in wine or water or broth, they soften into edibility and provide calories when nothing else is available. The Roman Empire was built partly on these humble biscuits, the portable calories that let armies march 4 months away from supply bases. Historians still argue whether Roman bread was as good as modern bread, or whether we're romanticising the past through the haze of 2 millennia. The truth is probably complex. Roman bread certainly had more flavour, more texture, more nutritional value than industrial white bread. But it was also inconsistent. One baker's loaf might be wonderful while another's was barely edible. It could be full of grit from imperfectly cleaned grain, or small stones from the millstones that ground the flour. Some Romans broke teeth on their bread, not from hardness but from literal rocks mixed into the flour. The quality control we take for granted simply didn't exist. But despite these flaws, bread remains the empire's great constant. While meat is expensive and vegetables are seasonal, and luxuries come and go with trade routes and political fortunes, bread is always there. It fills the bellies of slaves and senators alike, though in different qualities. It provides the bulk of calories for most Romans, who might eat a pound or more of bread per day in various forms. It's breakfast, it's lunch, it's part of dinner, it's snacks between meals. When you imagine a Roman eaten in any context, at any time of day, there's probably bread involved. The bakery's warmth feels good in the cool morning air. You linger a moment, watching the organised chaos of production, smelling that magnificent aroma of baking. This is Rome feeding itself, one loaf at a time, maintaining the delicate balance between a functioning empire and a hungry mob. The bread in your hands represents agriculture, transportation, commerce, government subsidy, skilled labour, and ancient tradition, all compressed into a simple food that most Romans take for granted. But without it, without this humble loaf that you might eat without a second thought, the entire structure of Roman civilization would collapse like a house made of straw. Do you remember your morning toast, grabbed quickly before rushing out the door? You're part of a tradition stretching back millennia, breaking your fast with grain transformed by human ingenuity into something greater than the sum of its parts. You pour yourself another cup from the jug, watching the pale liquid swirl as wine and water mix in ratios that would horrify a modern sommelier. This is your morning beverage, your hydration, your small dose of alcohol before the day has truly begun. And to Roman sensibilities, this is completely normal. Wine for breakfast isn't indulgence or alcoholism, it's safety, it's culture. It's simply what civilized people do when they need something to drink. Let's explore why Romans would rather consume fermented grape juice at dawn than touch plain water, and how this habit shaped their entire relationship with beverages. The Romans view water with deep suspicion unless it comes from specific, trusted sources. Aqueduct water flowing fresh from mountain springs is generally safe, and Romans drink it gladly when available. But well water, river water, water that's been sitting in cisterns or transported in containers, all of this carries risk. You can't see the bacteria and parasites that lurk in untreated water, but Romans have observed the connection between drinking certain water sources and getting sick. They don't understand the mechanism, but they've learned to be cautious through centuries of trial and unpleasant error. Wine, on the other hand, is safe. The fermentation process that turns grape juice into alcohol kills most of the nasty microorganisms that make water dangerous. Romans don't know about fermentation chemistry or the antimicrobial properties of alcohol and low pH, but they know empirically that wine drinkers stay healthier than water drinkers. So they drink wine constantly, from childhood to old age, though rarely at full strength. Drinking undiluted wine is considered barbaric, something only uncivilized foreigners and hopeless alcoholics do. Proper Romans always cut their wine with water, typically at ratios ranging from 1 part wine to 2 parts water, up to 1 part wine to 5 parts water, depending on the occasion and the quality of the wine. The drink in your cup right now is posca, the everyday beverage of common Romans, soldiers, and workers. It's made from a acetum wine that's gone sour, turned to vinegar or nearly so, mixed with water and sometimes flavoured with herbs or a bit of honey if you're feeling fancy. This isn't the pleasant wine you might sip at dinner. This is harsh, acidic, sharp enough to make your face pucker on the first sip of the day. But it's refreshing in its own way, especially on hot days when you're thirsty and need something that won't make you sick. Soldiers on campaign drink gallons of the stuff, using it to purify questionable water sources they encounter in the provinces. Even Jesus, according to one gospel account, was offered posca on the cross not as an additional cruelty but as a standard beverage that happened to be available. If you're wealthier, Your morning cup might contain mulsum, which is wine sweetened with honey rather than vinegar wine mixed with water. This is significantly more pleasant, the honey softening the wine's acidity and adding a floral sweetness that makes it almost dessert-like. Wealthy Romans sometimes drink mulsum before dinner as an aperitif, but it's also acceptable at breakfast, especially for those who can afford the honey. Honey is expensive, produced by bees that Romans keep in clay hives, harvested carefully and sold by weight like a precious commodity. Using it to sweeten your morning beverage is a small luxury that marks you as someone with resources to spare. The wine itself comes from vineyards throughout the empire, with certain regions already famous for producing superior vintages. Falernian wine from Campania is legendary, commanding prices that would make you weep. Wine from Greek islands is prized for its quality. Even Gaul and Hispania produce respectable wines that lubricate the empire's social and commercial interactions. The wine trade is massive, with amphorae shipping millions of gallons annually from producing regions to consuming cities. Rome alone drinks an almost incomprehensible amount. Estimates suggest the city consumes around 200 million litres per year, which works out to roughly a half litre per person per day, including children, slaves, and everyone else. But here's something that might surprise you. Roman wine tastes nothing like the wine you know. For one thing, they often flavour it with herbs, spices, and other additives. They might mix in rose petals, or pine resin to help preserve it, or various spices to mask the taste of wine that's starting to turn. They sometimes sweeten wine with defrutum grape juice boiled down to a syrup, which unfortunately means many Romans are chronically lead poisoned because they boil this syrup in lead vessels, and the lead leaches into the sweet liquid. This practice, completely unknown to them as dangerous, probably shortened countless Roman lives and may have contributed to the empire's eventual decline through widespread cognitive impairment among the elite who could afford heavily sweetened wines. The storage and serving of wine involves an entire infrastructure of pottery production. Amphorae, those distinctive two-handled clay jars with pointed bottoms, are manufactured by the millions, each one holding about 25 to 30 litres of wine. They're sealed with the clay stoppers and often marked with information about the wine's origin, vintage, and producer. Broken amphorae shards, archaeologists call them potsherds, litter ancient Roman sites in such quantities that in Rome itself, there's an entire artificial hill called Monte Testaccio, made entirely from discarded amphora fragments, reaching over 100 feet high. This mountain of broken pottery represents millions of gallons of wine consumed over centuries. A monument to Roman drinking habits. Your morning cup, humble as it is, connects you to this vast commercial network. The wine that flavours your posca might have been made in Spain and shipped to Rome in an amphora that took weeks to arrive. The water diluting it came through an aqueduct built by slaves and engineers, flowing from mountain springs miles away. The cup itself is clay, turned on a potter's wheel, fired in a kiln, sold in a market, and now in your hands, performing the simple function of holding liquid so you can drink without spilling. Historians still argue about whether Romans were functional alcoholics, drinking wine from morning to night, or whether the heavy dilution meant they consumed relatively little actual alcohol. The truth probably varies by individual and social class. A labourer drinking heavily watered posca all day probably stayed relatively sober, consuming the equivalent of maybe 1 or 2 modern beers spread across 12 hours, but wealthy Romans at their elaborate dinner parties, reclining and drinking cup after cup of less diluted wine, probably achieved significant intoxication regularly. The Romans certainly recognised drunkenness as a social problem. Their literature is full of warnings about excessive drinking and stories of men ruined by wine. But moderate, constant consumption of diluted wine was so normal as to be invisible, like drinking coffee or soda today. Some Romans do drink other beverages at breakfast. Though they are less common, milk is available. Though Romans find it somewhat barbaric, it's what children drink, or what rural people consume. Urban sophisticates prefer wine. In the eastern provinces, some people drink beer made from barley, though Romans consider this a foreign, inferior beverage compared to proper wine, and there are various medicinal drinks, herbal infusions that won't be called tea for centuries. Preparations of specific plants believed to have healing properties, tonics recommended by physicians for various ailments, but wine remains supreme, the default beverage, the liquid that accompanies every meal and fills the spaces between meals. You finish your cup of posca, feeling its acidic bite wake up your palate and settle your stomach, is not delicious. Not something you drink for pleasure, but it's familiar and functional, and right now that's exactly what you need. Outside, the city continues waking up, and thousands of other Romans are drinking their own morning cups, participating in this collective ritual of breaking fast with bread and watered wine, perpetuating traditions that feel as old as Rome itself. Your hand reaches again for the small clay pot where cheese sits submerged in cloudy brine, and beside it, the jar of olives glistening with oil. These two foods, cheese and olives, are breakfast companions so fundamental that imagining a Roman morning without them feels wrong, incomplete, like a sentence missing its verb. They appear at nearly every meal in some form, but at breakfast they serve a particularly important role as portable, preserved, ready-to-eat sources of fat, salt, and flavour that require absolutely no preparation. Let's explore why fermentation and preservation dominate Roman eating, and how these ancient techniques kept an empire fed. The cheese you pull from its brine is simple fresh cheese, what Romans call caseus recens, made within the last few days from sheep or goat milk. The texture is soft but not creamy, crumbly rather than smooth, with a clean, slightly acidic taste that comes from the fermentation process. Making this cheese requires no sophisticated equipment. Milk is heated gently. An acidic substance like vinegar or rennet from a calf's stomach is added to make it curdle. The curds are separated from the whey, pressed into shape and salted. The whole process takes a few hours and transforms highly perishable milk into something that lasts days or even weeks when kept in brine. But Romans don't stop with fresh cheese. They also produce aged cheeses that can last months or years, developing complex flavours and rock-hard textures that make them ideal for long-term storage or military campaigns. Cassius Lunensis from the town of Luna is famous throughout the empire. Aged for so long it becomes almost translucent and so hard it must be grated rather than sliced. These aged cheeses are expensive, too valuable for everyday breakfast, but they'd represent the pinnacle of Roman dairy preservation technology. A wheel of properly aged cheese is wealth you can store in your cellar, increasing in value as it matures, tradable for other goods, capable of feeding you through winters when fresh food disappears. The Romans inherited their cheese-making traditions from the Greeks and earlier Mediterranean cultures, then refined and expanded them across the empire. Different regions developed distinctive cheeses based on local milk, local climates, local techniques. The variety is actually impressive. Sources mention smoked cheeses, herb-flavoured cheeses, cheeses made in specific shapes for specific purposes. Roman soldiers carry cheese as part of their rations, knowing it provides concentrated calories and protein in a form that won't spoil even on long marches through hostile territory. Some historians argue that Roman military success owes as much to preserved foods like cheese as to superior tactics and discipline. The brine preserving your cheese is itself a preservation technology Romans use extensively. Salt is valuable. Soldiers are sometimes paid partly in salt, giving us the word salary, but it's worth the cost because it prevents spoilage, drawing water out of food and creating an environment where bacteria can't thrive. Everything gets salted meat. Fish, cheese, vegetables, even fruit sometimes. The empire's cuisine is intensely salty by modern standards, partly because preservation requires it, and partly because salt is one of the few reliable ways to add strong flavour to food. Your Roman palate is accustomed to levels of saltiness, that would make contemporary diners reach desperately for water. Now consider the olives sitting in their oil, each one a tiny package of fat and flavour preserved through techniques older than written history. Olives fresh from the tree are inedible, so bitter they'll make you gag, but cured properly they transform into something delicious and nearly immortal. The curing process varies. Some olives get packed in salt for weeks until the bitterness leaches out. Others get soaked in water that change daily. Still others get treated with lye from wood ashes to speed the process. After curing, they're stored in brine or oil, where they'll keep indefinitely, growing more flavourful as they age. The olive tree itself is sacred to Romans, a symbol of Minerva and a cornerstone of Mediterranean civilization. Olive groves cover hillsides throughout the empire wherever climate permits, their grey-green leaves and twisted trunks becoming so common in the landscape that Romans barely noticed them. But the economic importance is staggering. Olives provide oil for cooking, lighting, bathing, and cosmetics. They provide preserved fruit for eating. They provide wood for carving and fuel for burning. A productive olive grove represents intergenerational wealth because the trees live for centuries, each one producing olives year after year with relatively little labour required. You eat an olive now, biting carefully around the pit, feeling how the curing has transformed the fruit's texture into something almost meaty, dense and oily. The flavour explodes across your tongue. Salt, bitterness, fat, and something indefinably olive that no other food quite captures. Romans eat olives constantly, at breakfast and dinner, as snacks, pressed into oil, mixed into sauces. The variety is remarkable: green olives picked early, black olives left to ripen on the tree, olives flavoured with fennel or vinegar or fish sauce. Each region has its preferences, each household its favourite preparation method. The oil from pressed olives lubricates Roman life in ways that extend far beyond food. Every bathhouse uses olive oil for cleaning bodies before hot water, and strigils scrape away the mixture of oil and dirt. Lamps burn olive oil through the night, providing the only artificial light most Romans know. Athletes coat themselves in oil before exercising. Doctors use it in medicines. Women apply it to their skin and hair. This single product from a single tree is so versatile and valuable that controlling olive-producing regions means controlling wealth and power. But back to breakfast, you take another piece of cheese and pair it with an olive, eating them together in a combination that's been perfected over millennia. The cheese provides mild, creamy protein while the olive cuts through with its sharp saltiness and fat. Together with bread, these three elements create a nutritionally complete meal: carbohydrates from grain, protein from milk, fat from olives, plus enough salt to replace what you'll sweat out during the day's labour. It's not exciting, but it's efficient and reliable, and most importantly, it requires no cooking, no fresh ingredients, no resources beyond what can be stored for days or weeks in the corner of your room. This reliance on preserved foods isn't just convenience, it's necessity in a world without refrigeration, without canning, without any of the preservation technologies you take for granted. Food spoils rapidly in Mediterranean heat. Meat goes bad within hours unless treated. Milk sours overnight. Fresh produce attracts insects and mould. So Romans developed an entire cuisine based on preservation, transforming perishable ingredients into stable ones through salting, drying, smoking, pickling, and fermenting. Your breakfast is a testament to these techniques. Every element processed somehow to survive long enough for you to eat it. Historians still argue about Roman nutrition and whether preserved foods provided adequate vitamins and minerals, or whether chronic deficiencies weaken the population. The heavier reliance on bread, cheese, and olives certainly provided calories and prevented starvation, but it probably left many Romans lacking in vitamin C, fresh vegetables, and diverse nutrients. Those who could afford fruit, fresh fish, and varied dinner menus stayed healthier than those subsisting primarily on the preserved trinity of grain, dairy, and olives. Class affected not just the quality of your food, but literally the health of your body, the length of your life, the vitality of your children. Yet even acknowledging these limitations, the Roman system of food preservation was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Fermentation, salt curing, oil storage. These techniques kept an empire of millions fed even when harvests failed in one region, even when armies marched far from supply bases, even when ships couldn't sail due to winter storms. Your simple breakfast of cheese and olives represents centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to make food last, how to store summer's abundance for winter's scarcity, how to feed a civilization that sprawls across 3 continents and endures for centuries. You notice a small clay jar in the corner of your shelf, one you haven't opened yet this morning, and inside is something that makes even your simple breakfast feel slightly luxurious honey, thick and golden, catching the early light like amber. Next to it, a few wrinkled figs from last autumn's harvest sit in their dried, concentrated sweetness. These are the treats of Roman breakfast, the rare moments of pure sweetness in a cuisine dominated by salt, oil, and fermentation. Let's explore how Romans satisfy their craving for sugar in a world that doesn't yet know about sugarcane or chocolate, or any of the sweet things you consider ordinary. Honey is Rome's only concentrated sweetener, and it's precious enough that you use it sparingly. Knowing each spoonful represents hours of beekeeping labour and the work of thousands of bees. Romans keep bees in clay cylinders stacked horizontally, harvesting honey once or twice a year in a process that's smoky, sticky, and occasionally painful when the bees object to having their stores stolen. The honey that results is unpasteurized, unfiltered, often containing bits of wax and the occasional dead bee, but its flavour is complex and floral in ways that processed modern honey can't match. Each batch tastes slightly different depending on which flowers the bees visited. Thyme honey from coastal regions, acacia honey from forests, flower honey from meadows. You drizzle a thin stream of honey over a piece of bread, watching it pool in the bread's irregular surface, soaking in slowly. The sweetness hits your tongue like a small revelation after the salt and acid of cheese and posca. Romans love honey obsessively, using it in cooking, baking, medicine, and preservation. They mix it with wine to make balsam. They use it to preserve fruit. They spread it on bread. They incorporate it into elaborate desserts served at wealthy dinners. Honey appears in Roman medical texts as a cure for everything from wounds to digestion problems, some of which claims are actually valid. Honey does have antimicrobial properties that help prevent infection, though Romans don't understand why. But honey is expensive, often costing more per pound than decent wine, so most Romans consume it rarely. Your small jar might last weeks or even months, doled out in careful amounts for special mornings, or when you're feeling slightly ill and want something soothing. Beekeepers who maintain large operations can become wealthy, selling their honey to urban markets where demand always exceeds supply. Some regions are famous for producing superior honey. Attic honey from Greece is legendary, commanding premium prices, while local honey varies wildly in quality and flavour. The dried figs sitting next to your honey jar tell a different story of sweetness fruit, preserved through simple dehydration. Concentrated natural sugars making them candy-like without any processing. Figs grow abundantly in Mediterranean climates, producing 2 crops per year in some locations, and the trees require little maintenance once established. Fresh figs are wonderful, but last only days before spoiling. Dried figs, however, can last months or even years if stored properly in sealed containers away from moisture and insects. You pick up a fig now, feeling its leathery exterior, biting into the dense, sticky interior where tiny seeds crunch between your teeth. The sweetness is intense, almost overwhelming. Nothing like the subtle fresh fruit, but something entirely different and equally valuable. Romans eat dried figs constantly at breakfast as snacks, chopped into dishes, soaked in wine until they plump up again. Soldiers carry them on campaign. Travellers pack them for journeys. Children receive them as treats. The poet Martial writes about figs multiple times, both fresh and dried, praising their flavour and availability. Pliny the Elder catalogues numerous fig varieties in his Natural History, discussing which regions produce the best fruit and how to properly dry and store them. This attention to figs in literature reveals their importance in daily Roman life. They're not exotic luxuries, but everyday foods that happen to be sweet, making them special in a cuisine that offers few other sweet options. Other dried fruits appear occasionally at Roman breakfast tables, though less commonly than figs. Dates from North Africa and the eastern provinces are prized for their intense sweetness and high calorie content, but they're expensive in Rome, imported from far away, more likely to appear at wealthy dinners than common breakfasts. Raisins dried grapes are produced wherever wine is made, a way of preserving surplus grapes that can't be fermented or sold fresh. Dried apples and pears appear in regions where these fruits grow, though they are less sweet than figs or dates and less popular as a result. Some Romans, particularly wealthy ones, might have fresh fruit at breakfast during harvest season apples, pears, cherries, plums, whatever the season and region provide. But fresh fruit is ephemeral, available only at specific times, and it spoils so quickly that it's usually reserved for dinner when it can be properly appreciated, rather than gulped down during the rushed morning meal. Your breakfast is more likely to feature dried fruit if it features fruit at all, sweetness preserved and concentrated. Some are captured in wrinkled packages that survive until winter and beyond. Historians still argue about whether Romans suffered from inadequate fruit consumption, particularly in winter, when even dried varieties became scarce. Scurvy vitamin C deficiency certainly existed, though Romans didn't understand its cause or cure. Sailors on long voyages sometimes developed the disease, their teeth loosening and wounds failing to heal. The urban poor, subsisting mainly on bread and a little cheese, probably experienced chronic low-level nutrient deficiencies that weaken their health without causing obvious disease. Those wealthy enough to eat fruit regularly, along with fresh vegetables and varied diets, stayed healthier than their poorer neighbours. Another way that class determined not just comfort but survival. But sweetness itself, regardless of its nutritional value, serves an important psychological function. The human craving for sugar is ancient and powerful, probably evolved from times when sweet foods indicated safe, ripe, calorie-dense options worth seeking out. Your Roman breakfast might be simple and repetitive, but that small drizzle of honey or the chewy sweetness of a dried fig transforms it from mere fuel into something approaching pleasure. These moments of sweetness are rare enough to feel special, common enough to be within reach occasionally, creating small bright spots in days that might otherwise feel relentlessly difficult. You finish your honey-drizzled bread slowly, savouring it, knowing tomorrow morning you'll probably skip the honey to make the jar last longer. The fig you save for later, a sweet reward for yourself after completing some morning task. This careful rationing of treats is second nature to you, as it is to most Romans who understand that resources are finite and must be managed carefully. The abundance mindset, the casual waste, the expectation of sweetness at every meal, these are luxuries of a future you can't imagine, built on industrial agriculture and global supply chains, and refined sugar extracted from plants that don't grow anywhere near Rome. For now, you have your small jar of honey, your handful of dried figs, and the knowledge that sweetness, like most good things in Roman life, comes in small, precious doses that make you appreciate it all the more. Do you remember the last time you truly savoured something sweet? Rather than consuming it mindlessly, the Romans, with their limited access to sugar, might actually have enjoyed their sweetness more intensely than you enjoy your abundant modern desserts. You sit alone with your breakfast, chewing slowly, and the silence feels normal, unremarkable, exactly as breakfast should be. There's no conversation, no family gathered around a table, No morning ritual of togetherness. Roman breakfast is a solitary affair, a private moment of refueling that happens in isolation, or perhaps with a few casual words exchanged with whoever happens to be nearby. This stands in stark contrast to the elaborate social theatre of Roman dinner, and understanding this difference reveals something profound about how Romans structure their days and relationships. Let's explore why you eat this meal alone, and what that says about Roman values around food and community. The Roman day is built around cena, the evening meal that typically begins in the late afternoon, around the 8th or 9th hour by Roman timekeeping, which translates to roughly 2 or 3 o'clock by modern clocks. This is when Romans actually eat in the social sense, reclining on couches arranged in a triclinium, engaging in conversation, sometimes hosting guests, taking their time over multiple courses, drinking wine that's less diluted than usual, enjoying entertainment from musicians or poetry readings if they're wealthy enough. Dinner is performance, dinner is politics, dinner is where business deals happen and social bonds form and marriages are arranged. Dinner matters. Breakfast, by contrast, matters hardly at all. You eat it standing up or sitting casually, often while doing something else, getting dressed, reviewing the day's plans, perhaps reading if you're literate and wealthy enough to own books. There's no ceremony, no proper dishes necessarily, no expectation that other household members will coordinate their breakfast time in with yours. If you're a slave, you grab food whenever your morning duties permit. If you're a labourer, you eat quickly before heading to work. If you're wealthy, you might have a slave bring you breakfast in your room, but even then you're probably eating alone, your spouse still asleep or eating separately, your children attended to by their own caregivers. This solitary breakfast pattern isn't unique to Romans. It appears in many ancient cultures and persists in various forms even today, but it's particularly pronounced in Rome, where the social meal is so emphatically relegated to evening that everything before it feels like mere preparation, a practical necessity rather than an occasion worth marking. Some historians suggest this pattern developed because mornings were for work heading to the forum, opening your shop, labouring at your trade. Managing your properties and work is serious business that shouldn't be delayed by leisurely meals. Better to eat quickly and get to the important parts of the day. The physical setup of most Roman homes reinforces this solitary breakfast pattern. The triclinium, that formal dining room with its arranged couches, is specifically designed for evening meals. There's no breakfast nook, no kitchen table where family gathers casually. Most Romans eat breakfast wherever it's convenient in their bedroom, on a bench near the door, standing in the atrium, sitting on their bed. The meal is so informal it doesn't even require dedicated space. You eat where you happen to be when hunger and food intersect, and then you move on to whatever comes next. If you're sharing living space with others, family members, fellow tenants in a crowded insula, slaves sleeping in common areas, you might eat breakfast in proximity to other people without really eating with them in any meaningful sense. Someone might be munching bread in one corner while someone else drinks posca in another corner, but there's no shared experience. No conversation structured around the meal. No how did you sleep or what are your plans today. That kind of morning interaction, if it happens at all, happens separately from eating. The food is just fuel, consumed efficiently, not an excuse for gathering. There are exceptions, of course. Military camps operate on different schedules, with soldiers sometimes eating morning rations communally as part of their regimented routine, though even then it's quick and functional rather than social. Some work environments, construction sites, workshops with multiple labourers, ships with crews might see groups of people eating breakfast together simply because they're already together for work. But even this proximity doesn't transform breakfast into a social meal. You might crack a joke with the person next to you, but you're not hosting them. You're not making an occasion of it. The midday meal, prandium, occupies an interesting middle ground. It's slightly more substantial than breakfast, but still not particularly social. Some people eat it at home, others grab something from street vendors. Others might meet a friend casually for a quick meal at a tavern or thermopolium. It's more social than breakfast, but nowhere near the production that dinner becomes. Think of it as the Roman equivalent of a business lunch functional with possibilities for conversation, but nobody's reclining on couches or staying for hours. This hierarchy of meals, with dinner towering above the others in importance, shapes your entire relationship with food. You don't think about breakfast as something to plan or look forward to or discuss with others. It's just something you do, like washing your face or putting on your tunic, a necessary step in preparing yourself for the day. The emotional energy, the anticipation, the social meaning, all of that gets saved for dinner. If someone invites you to dinner, that's significant, worth noting, worth preparing for. If someone shares breakfast with you, it's probably accidental, just two people who happen to be eating at the same time in the same place. Historians still argue about whether this pattern was universal across all Roman social classes, or whether poor families squeezed into tiny apartments might have shared breakfast more communally out of sheer proximity and lack of space. The evidence is frustratingly thin. Ancient writers rarely described ordinary breakfast routines because they were too mundane to warrant attention. We know elaborate dinners in great detail because wealthy Romans wrote about them, bragged about them, criticised each other's dinner parties in surviving letters, but breakfast almost nothing. It was so unremarkable that it barely appears in the historical record, leaving us to reconstruct it from scattered references and archaeological evidence. What we do know is that for most Romans, breakfast is something you experience alone, in the quiet of early morning, before the city fully wakes and demands your attention. It's a moment of solitude, whether you want it or not. A private transaction between your hunger and whatever food you have available. There's something almost meditative about it. This daily ritual performed without audience or acknowledgement, so ordinary it becomes invisible. You chew your bread, drink your posca, and prepare to enter the social world where what you eat and with whom you eat it will suddenly matter enormously, but only once the sun begins its afternoon descent and dinner time approaches. For now, you're alone with your simple meal, and that's exactly as it should be. The solitude of breakfast is as much a Roman tradition as the communal feast of dinner, two sides of the same cultural coin that determines when food brings people together and when it simply fills an empty stomach in preparation for the real business of living. You finish your simple breakfast at home and step out into streets already buzzing with activity, and immediately you're surrounded by the smells and sounds of Rome's other breakfast solution, street food. Fast food. Takeaway meals sold from counters and carts to the thousands of Romans who can't or won't cook at home. The thermopolium on the corner is already serving customers, steam rising from the large clay pots embedded in its stone counter, and you realise that for many Romans this is breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner too. Let's explore this ancient fast food culture that fed a city of millions long before anyone dreamed of drive-through windows or delivery apps. The thermopolium, literally a place where hot things are sold, is one of Rome's most important and overlooked institutions. These establishments dot every neighbourhood, sometimes multiple per block in busy areas, each one essentially a restaurant without seats, designed for quick service to customers who eat standing up or take their food elsewhere. The setup is brilliantly simple. A masonry counter faces the street, with large clay vessels called dolia embedded directly into the stone, their contents kept warm by hot water or coals underneath. Each pot holds something different: chickpea stew, lentil soup, boiled grains, sometimes meat if the proprietor can afford it, vegetables cooked until soft. You approach the counter now, joining two other customers already pointing at what they want. The proprietor, a freedman who saved for years to open this establishment, uses a ladle to scoop portions into small clay bowls or onto flat bread that serves as an edible plate. The speed is impressive. He knows his customers want fast service, not conversation or ceremony. You point to the lentil stew, and within seconds it's in your hands, still hot. With a piece of bread for soaking up the liquid, you pay a few bronze coins as a price that's affordable even for day labourers and slaves sent on errands, though it still adds up if you eat this way for every meal. The food itself is simple but filling, designed to provide maximum calories at minimum cost. Lentils and chickpeas are cheap protein sources, requiring no refrigeration and cooking into substantial stews with just water. Salt, and maybe some olive oil if the proprietor is generous. Grains like barley or wheat get boiled into porridges that fill bellies efficiently. Vegetables like onions, cabbage, or turnips add bulk and flavour when available. The taste is fine. Not exciting, oversalted probably, a bit greasy. Definitely not gourmet, but it's hot. It's ready immediately, and it quiets the hunger that drove you here. This is breakfast for perhaps half of Rome's population, maybe more. Think about the logistics. Most people live in insulae where cooking fires are forbidden or severely restricted. Many work jobs that require leaving home before dawn. With no time to prepare food, even those who could cook at home often choose not to because it's easier and sometimes even cheaper to buy prepared food than to maintain cooking equipment, fuel, and ingredients. The thermopolium solves all these problems at once, creating a network of affordable feeding stations that keeps the city functional. But thermopolia aren't the only street food option. As you walk through the morning streets, you encounter vendors selling specific items from portable setups, a woman with a basket of fresh rolls, a man with a brazier cooking sausages that smell magnificent, another vendor offering chickpeas roasted until they're crunchy and addictive. These mobile operators have less overhead than thermopolium owners, so they can charge even less, though their offerings are narrower. You might buy a handful of roasted chickpeas for a copper coin, eating them as you walk. The salt and crunch satisfying something that yesterday's bread and cheese didn't quite address. Some vendors specialise in breakfast specifically, understanding that morning customers want particular things. There's a stall that sells nothing but warm porridge, flavoured with honey if you pay extra. Another focuses on boiled eggs. Yes, Romans do eat eggs, though more commonly at street stalls than at home, kept warm in a pot of hot water, sold by the piece, eaten while standing with salt from a communal dish. The vendor cracks the shell for you if you look like you're in a hurry, a small service that makes the transaction even faster. 2 eggs and some bread make a reasonable breakfast, and you're on your way in under a minute. The social world of street food is fascinating and complex. These establishments occupy an ambiguous space in Roman society, necessary and appreciated, but also slightly disreputable. Respectable, wealthy Romans generally don't eat at thermopolia, or if they do, they don't advertise it. These places are associated with the working poor, with slaves and freedmen, with people who lack the resources or stability for proper home life. They are also associated with gambling, day drinking, and the kind of casual social mixing that makes the upper classes nervous. Taverns and thermopolia are where different classes encounter each other in ways that don't happen elsewhere, where a dock worker might stand next to a clerk, where social hierarchies temporarily blur over shared bowls of cheap stew. But here's the thing, everyone uses them anyway. A patrician might send a slave to fetch food from a thermopolium rather than go himself, maintaining the fiction that he doesn't patronise such establishments. A merchant might grab a quick bite between business deals, eating standing up in an alley rather than at the counter where someone might recognise him. The food is too convenient, too affordable, too perfectly suited to Roman urban life for anyone to completely avoid it, regardless of social pretensions. Historians still argue about how much of Rome's population depended primarily on street food versus home cooking. The evidence from Pompeii, as instructive archaeologists have found over 150 thermopolia in a city of only 10 to 15,000 people, suggesting roughly 1 thermopolium per 100 residents. That's an extraordinarily high density, indicating these establishments served most meals for most people. The ratio might have been even higher in Rome itself, where population density was more extreme and home cooking even less practical. The health implications of this diet are interesting to consider. Eating the same simple stews and porridges day after day probably led to nutritional deficiencies, though the variety of grains, legumes, and occasional vegetables provided better nutrition than bread alone. The lack of fresh produce in winter, the heavy reliance on salt for preservation and flavour, the questionable cleanliness of shared serving utensils. All of these probably contributed to chronic health issues among Romans who ate primarily from street vendors. But the alternative starvation or the constant risk and expense of maintaining home cooking setups was often worse. You finish your lentil stew and hand the bowl back to the proprietor, who will rinse it cursorily and use it for the next customer. The bread is gone too, used to soak up every last bit of liquid because wasting food isn't something you can afford. Your stomach feels satisfied now, full in a way your home breakfast of bread and cheese didn't quite achieve. The hot food hit differently, warming you from inside, making the morning feel more manageable. You've joined the daily routine of millions of Romans, fed by an industry that exists to solve the fundamental problem of urban life. How do you feed massive numbers of people who have no way to cook for themselves? The thermopolium will serve customers all day, from before dawn until well after dark. An always open option for anyone with a few coins and an empty stomach. Is not romantic, not the kind of dining experience anyone would write poetry about. But it's profoundly democratic in its way. Anyone can eat here, regardless of status, as long as they can pay. The food is the same whether you're a citizen or a slave, whether you're heading to manual labour or to a clerk's desk. In this moment, standing at the counter with stew in your hands, you're just another hungry person in a city that never stops eating, never stops moving, never stops demanding more from the people and systems that keep it alive. You hear the sound before you see them, the rhythmic tramp of hobnailed sandals on stone, the clatter of equipment, the low voices of men used to moving in formation even when they're just walking through the city. A century of soldiers passes on the street, perhaps 50 men heading somewhere with purpose, and you think about what their breakfast was like this morning, because military rations represent a completely different approach to the morning meal. Let's march with the legionaries now and discover how Rome's most disciplined institution feeds its warriors. Because the empire was built not just on strategy and steel, but on portable, preserved food that could fuel soldiers for months away from civilization. The Roman legionary receives a daily grain ration about 3 pounds of wheat per day, which seems like an enormous amount until you consider the physical demands of military life. Marching 20 miles in full gear, building fortifications, training with weapons, all while carrying 60 pounds of equipment, this burns calories at a ferocious rate. That 3 pounds of grain, when ground into flour and baked into bread or boiled into porridge, provides roughly 3,000 calories, barely enough to maintain body weight under campaign conditions. Soldiers are almost always hungry, their rations calculated to keep them functional rather than comfortable. But here's what's interesting, the Legion doesn't provide bread already baked. Instead, soldiers receive raw grain that they must process themselves or pay to have processed. Each contubernium, an 8-man squad that shares a tent and meals, has a small hand mill. Basically 2 circular stones where grain goes between them, and soldiers take turns pushing the handle around and around, grinding wheat into flour over the course of hours. It's back-breaking, mind-numbing work. Usually assigned to the newest or lowest-ranking member of the group, though they rotate the duty to maintain fairness. The sound of these mills grinding becomes the background noise of any Roman military camp. Hundreds of men processing their grain simultaneously, creating a constant low grinding that soldiers learn to sleep through. Once the grain becomes flour, soldiers face another choice: bake it into bread if they have time and access to ovens, or simply mix it with water into a thick porridge that can be cooked over a campfire in a bronze or clay pot. Porridge is faster, requires less fuel, and works even when the legion is on the move with no permanent camp established. It's also monumentally boring: flour, water, salt if you're lucky, cooked until it's thick enough to eat with your fingers or a wooden spoon. Soldiers eat this porridge twice a day, sometimes 3 times, week after week, month after month. It keeps them alive but provides almost no pleasure, which is probably why soldiers spend considerable portions of their pay on additional foods when they are available. The Legion also provides a ration of posca, that vinegar wine mixture you know from civilian life. Though military posca tends to be even more heavily diluted and acidic than what common Romans drink, soldiers receive this daily, knowing it makes questionable water sources safer and provides a small amount of alcohol to take the edge off military discipline's harshness. Some historians suggest Roman military success owes something to posca, while enemy soldiers might drink from contaminated streams and fall ill. Romans drinking wine-treated water stayed healthier and more combat-ready. Beyond the basic grain and posca, soldiers receive an occasional allowance for pulmentarium, literally relish or accompaniment, meaning anything that makes the bland grain porridge more tolerable. This might include olive oil, salt, sour wine, dried meat if available, cheese, and vegetables when the Legion can procure them locally. But these additions are irregular and often require soldiers to spend their own money, creating a military economy where those with resources eat significantly better than those without. A wealthy soldier might purchase dried fruits, better cheese, even wine at full strength, transforming his rations into something almost pleasant. A poor soldier eats porridge with water and salt. Period. The Legion also provides bucellatum, a type of hardtack biscuit that's been twice baked until it's rock hard and nearly indestructible. This is the food that fuels long campaigns away from supply bases, marches through hostile territory where foraging is impossible, sieges that last months. Bucellatum can last for years without spoiling, resistant to mould, insects, and moisture. The downside is that eating it risks breaking teeth unless you soak it first in water, wine, or broth until it softens into something chewable. Soldiers develop techniques for this, breaking the biscuit into smaller pieces, soaking overnight in their water rations, even grinding it back into a coarse flour that can be cooked into porridge. It's survival food, not eating for pleasure. Roman military breakfast then typically consists of leftover porridge from the night before, eaten cold or warmed slightly over the morning fire, perhaps with a piece of bucellatum softened in posca. Maybe some cheese if the soldier purchased it, or received it in a care package from home. The entire meal takes perhaps 10 minutes, eaten while performing other morning tasks, checking equipment, cleaning weapons, preparing for the day's march or duties. There's no leisure in military breakfast, no sitting and savouring. You eat to fuel your body, and then you do what Rome requires of you. The logistics of feeding a legion roughly 5,000 men plus support personnel are staggering when you actually think about them. That's 15,000 pounds of grain per day, plus oil, salt, wine, and whatever else the soldiers require. Supply trains follow legions on campaign. Long lines of wagons or pack animals carrying food, accompanied by merchants hoping to sell additional provisions to soldiers with money. When campaigns extend into months or years, the Legion establishes farms nearby, contracts with local populations for food, sometimes simply takes what it needs through requisition or force. The Empire's expansion is driven partly by soldiers following their stomachs, moving toward regions that can feed them. Historians still argue about whether Roman military rations were adequate for the physical demands placed on legionaries. Modern nutritional analysis suggests the diet was probably deficient in vitamin C, leading to scurvy on extended campaigns without access to fresh fruits or vegetables. The heavy reliance on grain provided carbohydrates and some protein, but lacked dietary diversity. Soldiers who could afford to supplement their rations with purchases or foraged foods stayed healthier than those surviving on bare rations alone. Yet despite these limitations, Roman soldiers conquered most of the known world, suggesting the rations were at least adequate for sustaining combat effectiveness, if not optimal health. One story captures something essential about Roman military food when Caesar's soldiers ran short of grain during the siege of Alesia. They ate roots and bark rather than abandon the campaign. This wasn't heroism exactly, it was the understanding that their survival depended on Roman victory. That going home defeated meant going home to nothing. The food they ate, bland and monotonous as it was, represented the empire's commitment to keeping them alive and functional. In return, they gave Rome their strength, their loyalty, and when necessary, their lives. You watch the soldiers disappear down the street, and you think about the breakfast they ate this morning, probably cold porridge, possibly some hardtack, definitely posca to wash it down. Not so different from civilian breakfast in its simplicity, but eaten with the knowledge that today might bring a 20-mile march in full gear, or weapons training until muscles scream, or the sudden chaos of battle. Their breakfast isn't leisure, it's fuel for the empire's expansion. Calories converted directly into military power. The foundation of Rome's dominance compressed into bowls of grain and cups of sour wine. You travel now beyond Rome itself, leaving the city's walls behind and journeying across the vast empire where millions of other people are also breaking their fast this morning. And you discover that breakfast changes dramatically depending on where you are. The Roman Empire sprawls across 3 continents, encompassing dozens of distinct cultures and climates. And while Roman administration and military force create political unity, the food people eat for breakfast remains stubbornly local, adapted to regional ingredients and ancient traditions that predate Rome's arrival by centuries. Let's explore how breakfast transforms as you move from Egypt's deserts to Britannia's foggy shores, discovering the provincial variations that make Roman breakfast far more diverse than the simple bread and cheese stereotype suggests. In Alexandria, where you arrive first on your imaginary journey, breakfast feels distinctly different from what you left behind in Rome. The Mediterranean is the same sea, but everything else has changed. Egyptian bread is made partly from emmer wheat, an ancient grain that produces denser, more nutritious loaves than the common wheat Romans prefer. The bread tastes earthier, slightly nutty, and Egyptians eat it with date syrup instead of honey, because dates grow in abundance along the Nile while beekeeping produces less honey in Egypt's dry climate. Your morning drink might include beer, yes, beer for breakfast, brewed from barley in the traditional Egyptian way that predates Rome by millennia. The Romans officially disapprove of beer as a barbarian beverage, but Egyptian Romans drink it anyway, maintaining traditions their ancestors followed when pharaohs still ruled the Nile. The cheese you eat here comes from water buffalo rather than sheep or goats, giving it a creamier texture and milder flavour. Your olives taste different too. Cured with different spices, cumin and coriander appear in Egyptian olive preparations, flavours rarely found in Italian versions, and if you're near the Nile during fishing season, your breakfast might include small dried fish, salty and intense, eaten with bread in a combination that would puzzle Romans back in Italy, but makes perfect sense here where the river provides abundant protein. The occupying Romans have imposed their administration, their taxes, their military presence, but they haven't imposed their breakfast Egyptians eat as their ancestors did, adapting Roman foods to local ingredients and preferences. Now travel northwest to Gaul, that vast region Rome conquered only a few generations ago, where Celtic traditions still run deep beneath a thin veneer of Romanization. Here breakfast becomes heartier, designed for colder climates and harder physical labour. The bread is darker, made from rye mixed with wheat, producing a sour, dense loaf that keeps you full longer than Mediterranean wheat bread. Your cheese comes from cows, which thrive in Gaul's green pastures in ways they never do in Italy's drier climate. The cheese itself is different larger wheels, aged longer, with sharper flavours that cut through the morning cold. Gauls drink milk more commonly than Romans, seeing nothing barbaric about it, and they add it to their morning porridge made from oats rather than wheat. This porridge is thick and warming, often cooked with leeks or onions if available, creating a savoury morning meal that provides insulation against the damp cold that seems to seep into everything north of the Alps. Some Gauls still prepare their porridge in the old Celtic style, cooking it in leather bags suspended over fires, a technique that horrifies proper Romans but works perfectly well. And when autumn comes, Gauls add apples to their breakfast, either fresh or dried, because apple orchards cover the countryside in regions where olive trees won't survive the winter. The drink here is often cerveza, the Latin term for beer that Romans borrowed from Gallic languages brewed from barley, and flavoured sometimes with herbs before hops become standard, is weaker than Egyptian beer, drunk throughout the day like Romans drink posca, acceptable for breakfast because it's safer than water from streams that might carry disease. Wealthy Romanised Gauls drink wine at breakfast to demonstrate their sophistication, but common people stick with beer, maintaining their ancestral preference even as Roman culture surrounds them. Cross the Channel now to Britannia, Rome's newest and most tenuous conquest, where breakfast becomes even more foreign to Mediterranean sensibilities. The climate here is wet and cool even in summer, making grain cultivation challenging but creating perfect conditions for raising livestock. British breakfast, consequently, features more animal products than you'd find in Rome, not just cheese but sometimes actual meat. Bacon from pigs raised in forests where they feed on acorns, creating meat with distinctive flavour that wealthy Romans actually prize as an expensive import. The bread in Britannia is coarse, made from barley or oats more often than wheat, because these grains tolerate the wet climate better. It's heavy and filling, designed to sustain people through long days of agricultural labour in conditions that are physically demanding in different ways than Mediterranean work. Your morning drink might be buttermilk, the liquid left after churning butter, which sounds unappetising to Roman ears but provides nutrition and is readily available in a dairy-focused culture. And in winter, when food becomes scarce, British breakfast might include blood pudding, made from pig's blood mixed with oats and fat, cooked until solid, sliced and fried. Romans who've been stationed here learn to eat it or go hungry. Some Britons still eat their traditional breakfast of bro's oatmeal mixed with water or milk, sometimes with a little fat stirred in for richness. It's simpler even than Roman breakfast, requiring no cooking beyond boiling water, eaten directly from the pot by families huddled around morning fires that fight against the damp cold. Roman soldiers stationed in Britannia write letters home complaining about the food, the weather, the general misery of being assigned to the empire's cold, foggy edge, but they adapt, eating what Britannia provides, because the alternative is starving. Travel south now to North Africa beyond Egypt, to the provinces of Mauritania and Africa Proconsularis, where breakfast takes on desert characteristics. Bread here is often flatbread, cooked quickly on hot stones rather than baked in ovens, eaten almost immediately while still warm. The cheese comes from goats adapted to sparse vegetation, producing milk that's tangier and stronger flavoured than Italian sheep cheese. Your morning meal might include olives again, but North African olives are different, smaller, more intensely flavoured, often preserved with harissa or other spice blends that make them fiery and complex. Couscous appears at breakfast in North Africa. Though Romans don't have a name for it, yet tiny granules of semolina that are steamed until fluffy, eaten with olive oil or a bit of fermented milk. Some North Africans drink palm wine, fermented from date palm sap, sweet and slightly alcoholic, Nothing like grape wine, but filling the same cultural niche. And in oasis towns, fresh dates appear at breakfast during harvest season, eaten by the handful, their intense sweetness providing quick energy for desert work. Historians still argue about how much Roman conquest actually changed provincial diets, or whether local foodways proved resistant to cultural imperialism. The evidence suggests a complex picture. Urban elites in provincial capitals adopted Roman foods and eating patterns to signal their status and integration into the empire, while rural populations continued eating as their ancestors had, barely touched by Roman influence beyond paying taxes. Soldiers stationed in provinces often adopted local breakfast foods out of necessity and availability, creating hybrid military cultures that blended Roman discipline with provincial provisions. In Hispania, breakfast might include gazpacho, though nothing like the cold soup, but rather bread soaked in water with olive oil, garlic, and vinegar, pounded into a paste and eaten as a thick, savoury breakfast. In Syria, you might eat labneh strained yogurt with olive oil and za'atar, accompanied by flat bread, continuing traditions that stretch back to ancient Mesopotamia in Dacia, recently conquered and barely pacified. Breakfast includes mamaliga cornmeal porridge, though corn hasn't arrived from America yet, so it's made from millet instead, cooked until thick and eaten with sheep's milk cheese. Each province adapts Roman breakfast frameworks to local reality, creating versions that share certain elements: bread of some kind, cheese of some kind, preserved foods while differing dramatically in specific ingredients and preparations. The empire's unity is administrative and military, not culinary. People eat what grows where they live, prepared in ways their grandmothers taught them, maintaining cultural identity through food even as Roman laws and Latin language surround them. Your breakfast, wherever you eat it in the empire, connects you to both Rome and to something older, more local, more resistant to conquest than political boundaries or military occupation. You wake this morning with a small ritual you barely notice, one so ingrained it feels like breathing before eating your first bite of bread. You pause at the household shrine, the lararium, tucked into an alcove near your door, and you break off a tiny piece of bread to leave as an offering. This is breakfast invisible companion, the religious and superstitious framework that surrounds even the most mundane meal. Because Romans understand that food isn't just nutrition, it's also sacrifice, obligation, communication with the divine forces that control whether you prosper or starve. Let's explore the spiritual dimensions of Roman breakfast, the gods who watch you eat, and the careful rituals that protect you from supernatural hunger. The lararium in your home is a miniature temple, just a small painted shrine or a niche in the wall, but its importance far exceeds its physical size. Here live your household gods, the lairs who protect your family, the penates who guard your food stores, the genius of the household head whose continued benevolence ensures prosperity. Every morning, before you eat, proper Romans are supposed to acknowledge these divine presences with small offerings. That piece of bread you place at the shrine, that small splash of wine you pour onto the household altar. These aren't optional courtesies, but necessary transactions with supernatural powers who can make your life comfortable or miserable depending on how you treat them. The ritual is quick, almost mechanical in its familiarity. You tear the bread, place it at the shrine, mutter a brief prayer or perhaps just a silent acknowledgement, and move on to eating. But this brief moment connects you to religious practice that predates Rome itself, stretching back to earliest agricultural societies that understood food as gift from divine powers that must be honoured. You're not actually feeding the gods, the bread will sit there until it grows mouldy, or you remove it days later, but you're demonstrating gratitude, respect, the understanding that you don't eat through your own effort alone, but through cosmic benevolence that requires acknowledgement. Some households perform more elaborate morning rituals, especially on religiously significant days or when seeking divine favour. The family might gather briefly at the lararium, even though breakfast itself is eaten individually, to offer prayers together before dispersing to their separate morning meals. The household head, as priest of his domestic cult, leads these observances, reinforcing his authority through religious role. Slaves participate too, acknowledging the household gods. Even though they have no independent relationship with these deities, the gods belong to the house, and everyone in it falls under their protection and scrutiny. Beyond household gods, certain deities have specific relationships with mourning and eating. Janus, god of beginnings, receives recognition at the start of each day. His name appears in morning prayers because he governs all transitions and thresholds, including the transition from sleep to wakefulness, from fasting to eating. Some Romans whisper his name before their first bite of the day, a tiny invocation so routine it's barely conscious. Aurora, goddess of dawn, receives acknowledgement when you step outside into morning light. Though she's less commonly worshipped than Janus in domestic contexts, Ceres, goddess of grain and agriculture, looms large in any discussion of breakfast because bread is her gift to humanity. Every loaf you eat represents Ceres' blessing, and Romans who forget this risk offending a goddess who controls whether crops grow or fail, whether grain shipments arrive or ships sink in storms. The Annona, that government grain distribution that keeps Rome fed, operates under Ceres' divine patronage, with officials offering sacrifices to ensure continued abundance. When you eat your morning bread, you're consuming not just calories but divine favour made physical, and this understanding shapes how carefully you treat even stale, forgotten loaves. Some breakfast foods carry particular religious significance. Honey, precious and rare, is often offered to household gods because its sweetness represents the good things in life that divine favour provides. Wine, even the sour wine of posca, connects to Bacchus, though his worship is more associated with evening drinking and celebration than morning necessity. Eggs, when they appear at breakfast, carry symbolic weight as representations of life and fertility, sometimes offered at shrines dedicated to Venus or other fertility deities. The Romans see divine presence everywhere, including in the most ordinary foods. Superstitions surround breakfast too, those semi-religious beliefs that aren't quite official theology but shape behaviour anyway. You've learned never to eat your last piece of bread alone. Always share it or save a portion for offering, because selfishness with food invites poverty. You've learned to pour a few drops of your morning drink onto the ground before drinking, acknowledging the earth spirits who live beneath your feet. You've learned that breaking bread with your left hand brings bad luck. That dropping food is an omen requiring interpretation. That certain foods eaten on certain days predict the future or protect against misfortune. Some of these superstitions relate specifically to breakfast timing. Eating before sunrise is sometimes considered unlucky, suggesting excessive greed or distrust of the gods to provide for you. Eating too late, after the sun is well risen, might indicate laziness or disrespect for the day's opportunities. The proper time for breakfast, that brief window after dawn but before serious work begins, represents a kind of divinely ordained schedule, disrupted only at risk of supernatural disapproval. Most Romans don't consciously think about these timing issues, but they feel vaguely uncomfortable when forced to eat at unusual hours, a discomfort rooted partly in religious conditioning. Religious festivals disrupt normal breakfast patterns throughout the Roman calendar. On certain holy days, you're supposed to fast until specific rituals are completed, which means delaying or skipping breakfast entirely while priests perform sacrifices and prayers. On other festivals, special breakfast foods are prescribed, particular breads baked in specific shapes, certain combinations of ingredients that honour particular deities. The Saturnalia in December involves elaborate role reversals where slaves eat before masters, and special honeyed cakes appear at breakfast tables as part of the festival's abundance. Religious observance and eating are so intertwined that separating them becomes impossible. Every meal has theological implications. Every food choice potentially affects your relationship with divine powers. Historians still argue about how seriously ordinary Romans took these religious breakfast obligations, or whether they were mostly performed by rote without real belief. The evidence suggests both sincere piety and mechanical habit coexisted, probably varying by individual and circumstance. Some Romans genuinely feared divine punishment for neglecting household gods or failing to offer food portions properly. Others went through the motions because tradition demanded it, not because they believed lightning would strike them for eating without prayer. The ubiquity of household shrines, the evidence of food offerings found at domestic altars, suggests that even skeptical Romans found it easier to observe the rituals than risk finding out whether the gods actually cared. There's also a practical dimension to these religious practices. They create mindfulness around eating, forcing you to pause and acknowledge your food's significance rather than mindlessly consuming it. That moment at the Lorarium before breakfast, brief as it is, interrupts the rush from sleep to work, creating a tiny space for reflection, gratitude, or at least the recognition that eating is a privilege not everyone enjoys. The religious framework, whether you believe it literally or not, prevents food from becoming completely mundane, maintains a sense that meals matter beyond pure nutrition. You finish your offering at the household shrine and finally eat your own breakfast. The bread somehow tasting slightly different after that small ritual acknowledgement. The gods, if they're watching, have been shown proper respect. The household spirits have received their portion. You've fulfilled your obligations to the supernatural forces that govern abundance and scarcity, health and illness, prosperity and poverty. Now you can eat your simple meal knowing you've done what proper Romans do, maintaining the delicate balance between human effort and divine favour that keeps your household safe, your stomach full, and your place in the cosmic order secure. The bread is just bread, but it's also prayer made edible, blessing made digestible, divine relationship made daily and routine. You chew your bread more slowly now, thinking about what you're putting into your body and what ancient physicians would say about this morning meal. Because Romans don't just eat, they worry extensively about how food affects their health, their humours, their very essence. Medical theory in your time is elaborate, confident, and often completely wrong by modern standards. But it shapes every Roman's relationship with eating, including breakfast. Let's explore what Roman doctors prescribe for the morning meal, why they issue warnings about eating too early or too much, and how medical beliefs transform simple bread and cheese into a calculated intervention in bodily health. The dominant medical theory, inherited from Greek physicians like Hippocrates and refined by Roman doctors like Galen, centers on the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile that must remain balanced for health. Every food affects these humours differently, either increasing or decreasing them, warming or cooling the body, moistening or drying internal systems. Breakfast, though minor, still impacts this delicate balance, and the wise Roman considers these effects before deciding what to eat. The bread you're consuming right now is considered warming and moistening, moderately so. Appropriate for most people, but potentially problematic for those with phlegmatic constitutions who already have excess moisture. Roman physicians generally advise against heavy breakfast, arguing that eating too much in the morning prevents proper digestion of the previous night's dinner, which might still be processing in your stomach. The digestive process, as Romans understand it, involves heat. Your stomach literally cooks food, breaking it down through internal fire, and introducing new food before the old food is fully processed creates a kind of digestive traffic jam that leads to illness. Better to eat lightly at breakfast, just enough to quiet hunger pangs, reserving serious eating for later when your digestive fire is strongest and most capable of handling substantial meals. Some physicians recommend specific breakfast timing based on individual constitution. If you're young and vigorous, with abundant internal heat, you can probably eat breakfast earlier and more substantially because your digestive fire burns hot enough to handle it. If you're elderly or sick, with diminished internal heat, you should wait longer after waking to break your fast, allowing your body's limited digestive capacity to fully process any remaining food from yesterday. The same logic applies to seasonal variation in summer. When external heat assists digestion, you can eat earlier and more heartily. In winter, when cold weakens digestive power, breakfast should be later and lighter. The texture of breakfast foods matters too in medical theory. Bread, being solid, requires more digestive work than porridge or soup, so it's considered more suitable for those with strong constitutions. Very fresh. Soft bread is easier to digest than hard, stale bread, which is why some physicians recommend that people with weak digestion seek out the freshest loaves possible despite the expense. The practice of soaking stale bread in wine or water isn't just about making it palatable, it's also about predigesting it externally, reducing the burden on your internal digestive processes. You're essentially starting digestion before food enters your mouth, a medical intervention disguised as food preparation. Cheese presents an interesting medical puzzle. It's considered cold and moist, which means it counterbalances bread's warming properties, creating a more neutral combination. But aged cheese becomes warming as it dries, changing its medical properties over time. Fresh cheese in brine is appropriate for hot summer mornings when you need cooling foods. Aged cheese works better in winter when your body requires warming. The same food transforms its medical significance through aging, requiring Romans to think carefully about which cheese to eat when. Wine in the morning receives mixed medical opinions. Some physicians praise diluted wine for stimulating digestion and warming the stomach, preparing it for the day's eating. Others warn that wine on an empty stomach can cause headaches and weaken the brain's functioning, making you less sharp for morning business. The solution most doctors recommend is precisely what you're already doing, drinking heavily diluted wine posca with food. Never on a completely empty stomach. The water content hydrates you. The wine content purifies the water, and the food content prevents the alcohol from rushing straight to your head. It's a balanced approach that addresses multiple health concerns simultaneously. Certain foods are specifically recommended or forbidden for breakfast by medical authorities. Honey is praised for breakfast consumption because it's considered warming and easily digestible, requiring minimal internal processing to convert into nourishment. Figs get mixed reviews. They're nutritious, but can cause digestive upset if eaten on a truly empty stomach. So doctors recommend eating them after bread rather than before. Olives are generally approved, providing necessary fats and helping other foods digest more smoothly. But raw vegetables almost universally forbidden at breakfast because they're considered cold and difficult to digest, requiring strong digestive fire that most people don't possess immediately upon waking. Historians still argue about whether Roman medical advice actually helped or harmed public health, or whether it was mostly neutral, wrong in theory, but cautious enough in practice to avoid major damage. The emphasis on moderate eating, on avoiding excess, on paying attention to your body's signals, all of this probably served people reasonably well, even if the theoretical framework was nonsense. The warnings against eating too much too early probably prevented some digestive distress, even if the explanations about humours and internal fires were completely incorrect. Some physicians develop elaborate breakfast prescriptions for wealthy clients, treating the morning meal as therapeutic intervention rather than simple feeding. If you're recovering from illness, your doctor might prescribe specific breakfast combinations, perhaps soft bread soaked in honeyed wine, believed to strengthen weakened bodies if you're suffering from excess yellow bile, causing irritability and insomnia. Your doctor might recommend cooling breakfast foods like fresh cheese with water-heavy vegetables, deliberately avoiding warming foods like aged cheese or wine. The breakfast becomes medicine, each component chosen for therapeutic effect rather than preference or availability. Athletes and gladiators receive special dietary advice that includes breakfast modifications. They're told to eat more substantially in the morning than ordinary Romans, building strength through increased food consumption. Barley porridge is specifically recommended for fighters because it's believed to build dense, powerful muscles, though it's also considered less prestigious than wheat. Gladiators eating barley porridge are sometimes mocked as barley eaters, but the practice continues because trainers observe that it works, even if they don't understand why. Modern analysis suggests barley's higher protein and fibre content probably did support muscle development and sustained energy better than wheat alone. Pregnancy brings its own set of breakfast recommendations. Pregnant women are advised to eat bland, easily digested breakfast foods, soft bread, mild fresh cheese, perhaps diluted honey water. Anything too strongly flavoured might cause nausea, and anything difficult to digest might harm the developing baby by using up digestive capacity needed for nourishing the fetus. Some physicians recommend pregnant women eat more frequent small meals rather than substantial dinner, shifting the daily eating pattern to accommodate changed physiological needs. Whether pregnant women actually follow this advice, expensive to implement and socially awkward, is another question. The poor, of course, have little opportunity to follow medical advice about breakfast. When you're eating whatever you can afford or whatever the thermopolium is selling that morning, you can't be choosy about whether foods are warming or cooling, easily digestible or challenging. Medical theory is, in many ways, a luxury of the wealthy, who have sufficient resources to make food choices based on health optimization, rather than simple availability. The working poor eat their bread and cheese and hope for the best, probably unaware that physicians have opinions about proper breakfast timing and composition. You finish your breakfast now with these medical theories floating somewhere in your consciousness, not explicit thoughts, but internalized caution about eating too much, too fast, too early. You've absorbed Roman medical culture enough to feel vaguely that your simple breakfast is appropriate, moderate, properly timed. Whether the theories are correct hardly matters. They've shaped your relationship with eating, creating patterns and beliefs that affect your health partly through actual physiological effects and partly through placebo and cultural conditioning. Your breakfast is nourishment, yes, but it's also medical intervention, preventive care, and participation in a health culture that sees food as medicine and medicine as food. Boundaries between them too blurry to distinguish clearly. You sit back now, your simple Roman breakfast finished, and you realise something surprising. The toast you grabbed this morning before starting your modern day isn't so different from what you just experienced 2,000 years ago. That piece of bread, maybe with butter or jam, consumed quickly while checking your phone or rushing to work, carries echoes of the Roman ientaculum in ways you never noticed before. The continuity is remarkable when you actually look for it. Threads of ancient breakfast culture woven so deeply into contemporary eating that they have become invisible. Let's trace these connections now, following breakfast forward through 2 millennia, discovering how Roman morning meals shaped European and eventually global breakfast traditions in ways that still affect what you eat today. The most obvious legacy is bread itself. Still the foundation of breakfast across much of the world. That toast sitting on your plate this morning, whether whole wheat or white, sourdough or sandwich bread, descends directly from Roman baking traditions. The techniques for milling grain, fermenting dough with wild yeast, baking in contained ovens. All of this comes from Roman technology, preserved through medieval monasteries and guild bakers who maintained the knowledge across centuries of political chaos following Rome's collapse. When you bite into toast, you're eating a food that would be recognizable to a Roman, even if the sliced uniformity and soft texture would puzzle them. The pairing of bread and cheese at breakfast persists throughout Europe and beyond, a combination so intuitive it feels natural rather than cultural. but it's cultural, specifically Mediterranean and Roman cultural, spread throughout the empire and maintained afterward. The French tartine with cheese, the Italian colazione with bread and cheese, the Spanish desayuno featuring both these are Roman breakfast direct descendants, barely modified. Even the English and American habit of cheese on toast or grilled cheese for breakfast traces back to this ancient pairing. Though Northern Europeans added butter, a dairy product Romans barely used, creating the richer, heavier versions common today. Wine for breakfast disappeared from most of the Roman Empire's successor cultures, replaced by water, beer, coffee, and tea. But the underlying principle survived. Breakfast requires liquid, ideally something more interesting than plain water. The medieval and early modern European habit of drinking small beer at breakfast, including for children, mirrors Roman posca usage exactly. Both cultures understood that fermented drinks were safer than potentially contaminated water, even if they didn't understand the microbiological reasons. When coffee and tea arrived from Arab and Asian sources, they took over wine and beer's breakfast role, providing safe, interesting liquids to accompany morning bread. Your morning coffee or tea is posca's descendant, serving identical functions: hydration, stimulation, ritual marking of the day's beginning. The timing and social structure of breakfast shows remarkable Roman persistence. Most contemporary breakfast remains quick, informal, often solitary, eaten before the day's serious activities begin. Dinner remains the primary social meal in most cultures, the time when families gather, when entertaining happens, when eating becomes experience rather than mere fueling. This Roman hierarchy of meals, with breakfast barely counting and dinner dominating, persisted through medieval times, through the Renaissance, through industrialization, all the way to today, when, despite occasional food writers declaring breakfast the most important meal, it remains the one most people skip or rush through when time is tight. The concept of street food and fast breakfast purchased from vendors rather than prepared at home, that's Roman thermopolium culture, barely changed. The coffee cart on your corner, the bagel shop, the drive-through breakfast sandwich, the convenience store muffin, all of these serve identical functions to Roman street food counters, feeding urban populations who lack time or facilities for home breakfast preparation. The foods have changed, the speed has increased, but the fundamental transaction remains the same: exchange coins for ready-to-eat breakfast items that require no preparation, consume them quickly while heading to work, repeat daily. Rome invented fast food culture, and we've never stopped participating in it. Preserved foods at breakfast show obvious Roman continuity. Your yogurt is Roman fresh cheese, basically identical in production method despite refrigeration improvements. Your jam is Roman honey-preserved fruit, using sugar instead of honey but serving the same purpose, making summer's abundance last through winter. Your cured meats, bacon, ham, sausage use Roman preservation techniques of salting and smoking, though modern refrigeration means they're less intensely preserved than Roman versions. Even your orange juice, seemingly modern, fulfills the Roman role of preserved fruit consumed at breakfast. It's just preserved through industrial processing rather than drying or honey packing. The class dynamics of breakfast remain surprisingly Roman too. Wealthy people still have more elaborate, higher quality breakfasts than poor people, though the gap has narrowed in developed countries. The expensive artisanal bread, imported cheese, fresh fruit, premium coffee, these are patrician breakfast translated into contemporary terms. The cheap white bread, processed cheese, instant coffee, or skip breakfast entirely, that's plebeian eating, updated but fundamentally unchanged. Food quality still correlates with income. Breakfast still reveals economic status, just as it did in ancient Rome. Religious breakfast rituals mostly faded from Western culture, though echoes remain. Saying grace before meals, including breakfast, is essentially the Roman household shrine offering translated into monotheistic terms acknowledging that food comes from divine sources and requires gratitude. The Christian practice of fasting before communion, abstaining from breakfast before attending church, mirrors Roman religious fasting requirements. Even the secular habit of pausing briefly before eating, collecting yourself, appreciating the meal, these are diminished versions of Roman breakfast's spiritual dimension, conscience of something significant happening, even when you can't quite articulate what. Historians still argue about how much Roman influence on modern breakfast is direct transmission versus independent rediscovery of practical solutions to universal problems. Did Europeans maintain Roman bread and cheese breakfast because Rome taught them and they never forgot? Or did they independently realize that preserved foods eaten quickly work best for morning meals? The answer is probably both some direct cultural transmission plus repeated rediscovery of solutions that work, creating convergent evolution of breakfast practices. But certain elements are definitely Roman inventions that spread globally through European colonization and cultural dominance. The 3-meal-a-day structure with breakfast, lunch, and dinner isn't universal or natural. Many cultures traditionally ate 2 meals or many small meals throughout the day. The Roman pattern of light breakfast, light lunch, heavy dinner spread throughout their empire and persisted afterward, eventually being exported worldwide as European powers colonized other continents. When you eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you're following a Roman schedule that became so normalized it feels like human nature rather than specific cultural choice. The very concept of breaking fast etymologically reveals the meal's relationship to religious and medical beliefs about nighttime as a period of necessary food abstinence. Romans didn't use this exact phrase, but they understood breakfast as ending the overnight fast, as transitioning from sleep state to active state, as the day's beginning marked through eating. This understanding persists in English breakfast, Spanish desayuno de ayuno, unfasting, French petit déjeuner, small de fast, and many other languages where the meal's name references ending abstinence. You stand up from your mental Roman breakfast table and return fully to the present, but the connections remain visible now where they were invisible before. That bagel you grabbed yesterday, Roman bread technology, circular shape and all, the cream cheese Roman fresh cheese, cultured and preserved, the coffee Roman posca's descendant, making your morning drink safe and stimulating. The fact that you ate it while walking to the subway, pure thermopolium culture. 2,000 years continuous. Even grabbing breakfast from a food cart because your apartment kitchen is too small and you're running late, that's Roman insular living. The same problems generating the same solutions across millennia. The Roman Empire fell. Its political structures collapsed. Its language fractured into dozens of descendants, its territories divided and redivided countless times. But breakfast survived essentially intact, so fundamental to human daily life that it transcended empire, outlasting emperors and armies and all the supposedly important historical events that dominate textbooks. The simple act of eating bread and cheese at dawn, quickly and without ceremony, preparing yourself for the day ahead, this proved more durable than any military conquest, more lasting than any architectural monument, more influential than any philosophical system. Rome's breakfast conquered the world more thoroughly than its legions ever did, creating an invisible empire of morning eating that still governs how billions of people begin their days. Your morning toast isn't just food, it's living history, ancient technology still functioning, Roman culture still shaping your behavior every time you grab a quick breakfast before work. The continuity is almost miraculous when you notice it. This unbroken chain of morning meals stretching back through great-great-grandparents to medieval peasants to Dark Age survivors to late Roman citizens to early imperial urbanites to Republican Romans to the first people who discovered that baked grain and fermented milk made an efficient, portable, quick meal that could fuel a day's work. They figured out breakfast so well that we're still essentially eating what they ate, doing what they did, participating in rituals they established so long ago that the people who invented them are dust, their names forgotten, their lives unrecorded, but their breakfast remains, solid and real as the bread in your hand. And now, as this long day of exploring Roman breakfast draws to a close, as the ancient city's sounds fade and the modern world returns, you carry with you this new understanding. Breakfast was never just breakfast, never merely fuel or obligation or forgettable routine. It was culture and technology and class and religion and health and preservation and military strategy and imperial logistics and human ingenuity solving the eternal problem of morning hunger with whatever resources and knowledge each era provided. The Romans ate their bread and cheese and watered wine, feeding an empire that would conquer the known world and then collapse into legend. But the breakfast remained, outlasting everything, persistent as dawn itself, quiet and humble and absolutely essential, the foundation upon which entire civilizations are built, one morning meal at a time, forever and always, until the last person wakes hungry and reaches for something, anything to break the night's long fast and begin again. Underscore, 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 underscore. The story winds down now like the day itself descending into comfortable darkness. Your journey through Roman breakfast time is complete, and as you close your eyes, you can almost smell that ancient bread baking, almost taste the salt of olives and cheese, almost feel the morning coolness before the Mediterranean sun climbs high. These simple foods sustained an empire, fed millions across centuries, connected people separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of generations. There's something deeply comforting in that continuity, in knowing that humans have always woken hungry and found simple, practical ways to satisfy that hunger before facing whatever challenges the day brings. Let the images fade now, the thermopolium counters, the military camps, the household shrines, the street vendors calling their wares. Let the taste dissolve honey and bread, cheese and wine, olives and figs. Let it all become soft and distant, important but not urgent, interesting but not demanding. You've learned something tonight, travelled somewhere unexpected, discovered connections you never imagined between ancient Rome and your modern morning routine. That knowledge will still be there tomorrow, waiting quietly like good bread in a cupboard, ready when you want it but patient in the meantime. Sleep comes easily now, naturally, your mind satisfied by this gentle journey through history's most ordinary meal. The Romans sleep too, across 2,000 years. Their breakfast tables empty now, their ovens cold, their voices silent, but the bread remains, somehow, in your toast and bagels. The cheese persists in your refrigerator. The wine transforms into your morning coffee, and you, connected to them through these simple foods and simple rituals, drift peacefully into dreams where maybe, just maybe, you'll wake in a Roman dawn and taste breakfast one more time as they tasted it new, necessary, and nourishing the eternal first meal of endless days, simple and perfect and enough. Sweet dreams, traveller, sweet dreams, end of script, sweet dreams.